Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my special guest, Jolyn Armstrong.
Yes, hi.
Hi. And you were involved with the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Is that right? Or
Yes, yes. Until recently commonly known as the Mormons. Now they've gone back to the original title in a rebranding effort. Yeah, the long title, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So, yeah.
and were you born into the Mormon faith?
I was. So, my and both of my parents, their entire families were in the faith as well. I think my mom was a couple of generations. I've heard stories of my dad's family all joining at the same time when he was a teenager before he married my mother. And I don't know if that him marrying her had something to do with that, but
Mm.
they both lived in Utah, which is kind of Mormon Mecca in the US. So that I'm sure had something to do with it as well.
I was surprised to, I only found this out recently, but I'm not American, so American history is not my prime subject. But that
Yeah.
Brigham Young moved the Mormons to Utah because it was part of Mexico.
Yeah, I guess it may have been. And honestly, I don't know the full history there either. I do know what Mormons are taught is that there was just tons of persecution against the Mormons back, in New York and in the Midwest where they were, and they just kept moving further west. They got to this place that became Utah, and they're like, okay, this is it. And so they developed it. That's yeah, and the Utah government has a huge Mormon influence. It's yeah, a Mormon state basically. I guess I could say that.
Yeah. And well, tell me something about what it was like being a child involved with this. You had to go to ceremonies of some kind, and
Yeah, for those who are less experienced with Mormonism, it is I can give you kind of an experience. When I was growing up, Mormonism was, 3 hours on Sunday. And then there were meetings before and after if you had any, you were involved in any other um, kind of subgroups or organizations, people who taught classes or whatever would meet before or after. The leaderships of that particular group would meet before or after whatever. So 3 hours on Sunday. Monday nights were family home evenings. So it was just with your family in your home, nobody else allowed. You just get together, learn a lesson, whatever. And then Wednesday nights and Thursday nights were different group nights. So youth group, the young men and young women would have activities, and the relief societies, the women's organization, they would have activities often on one of those nights as well. Um, and then we're kind of on our own the other nights. Every other week, the youth would get together for what they called stake dances. So a stake is just a group of people in a certain area. There are stakes all over the place. Um, so lots of youth activities there because you're supposed to just stay friends with people who are in the church, or if you're friends with people outside of the church, kind of the goal is to get them to join. So lots of opportunities for that. So then there were things, summer camps and things like that we went to as well. But the weekly stuff, that was really it.
mm. I
Yeah.
I lived in East Grinstead, which of course is the headquarters of Scientology,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about 5 miles away from the headquarters of the Mormons.
Oh.
And I actually came to know the bishop um, fairly briefly, but his daughter was at school with my daughter. They were both very young. And I think every 17 years, the church would be rededicated. And of course,
Okay.
it looks from the outside, it looks like a fairly conventional Christian church. But when you get inside, it's lots of little rooms and a great big thing surrounded by bulls where everybody, they went through all of the parish registers in the UK, and so that everybody could go to the Mormon heaven afterwards, which is a
Oh, yeah.
strange thought. but it was very good for our records because it actually put a record together of everything. For research. But the chap I went with was a kind of, well, it actually turned out he was a spy for Scientology, but that's another story altogether.
Oh, interesting.
He told me he'd been involved with the Mormons and that he really wanted to go back. And so I phoned the bishop up and I said, look, there's this chap and he'd really like to come back. And he said, but he's been involved with Scientology. I said, yes. He said, we won't have anybody that's been involved with Scientology. This idea that means you're damned forever. So
wow. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, and also not so sorry to hear that, just because it's also it's pretty damaging. So it's maybe not terrible to stay away, I guess.
I think, once people have had Scientology, they don't deserve anything else horrible happening to them.
Right, exactly. Just it's okay. Just stay away. We can relay information, those of us who have been there, but I was actually never I went, I think you're describing a temple, a Mormon temple.
Yeah.
And those experiences in the temple are really reserved. Not even every Mormon gets to go into the temple. So that may be helpful for your friend as well. So it's Mormons have to do specific things in order to be allowed to enter the temple. They have to attend all of their meetings. They have to live the word of wisdom. So, we can't eat or drink specific things, those kinds of things.
What are you not allowed to eat if you're a Mormon?
Well, I guess
alcohol is forbidden.
Yeah, alcohol, coffee, tea. They can't drink any of that. And then so I guess foods, it's just more general. You should eat healthily. You shouldn't eat anything that is mind altering or things like that. So the really specific restrictions are more on the drinks, really. So caffeine, although Mormons have invested in, I think, Coca-Cola, different. Yeah. But Mormons are really not supposed to drink caffeine. They're not supposed to drink anything or eat anything that would alter their state of mind.
Okay.
So
I saw a very good documentary years ago called Meet the Mormons, which was just fly on the wall, and they just followed a young Mormon missionary, and if I remember rightly, and it went very badly for the Mormons. They really did not look good because there was somebody spying all the time to make sure that the camera crew didn't get anything. And there was no voiceover. You just saw what was said, and it put you off completely. But am I remembering right that missionaries will be teenagers who are sent away from their families for, is it a period of 2 years?
Typically, yeah, the young men at 19 will go for 2 years. Young women wait a couple of years and go for sometimes a shorter period of time. And that's only if they haven't gotten married and started a family yet. But the men definitely 19 for 2 years.
Okay. And during that time, this documentary led me to believe they do not communicate with their families.
The whole time I was growing up, and until recently, I'm not sure, because I've been out of the Mormon church for a while. So I don't have exact timeframes of when this has changed. But when I was in, certainly when my brother served his mission there, he was able to communicate with us. I think on Mother's Day, he could call my mother, maybe Christmas Day, if I remember correctly. And then if he needed something, that was communicated either by letter, or his mission president or one of his leaders would let us know. Like, he kept getting his bike stolen. He had to ride a bike. And so he went through a number of bikes that my parents had to pay to replace. And so, things like that were communicated, like if he needed something, or if I know he got sick during that time, and that he may have been able to call when he was sick. Gosh, that was so long ago. I barely remember, but typically they weren't. Now, more recently, now they are able to get on social media, and communication has been increased. And I think that largely was because of the mental health issues that were happening during, having these boys separated from their families and put into this situation for 2 years at a time when you need your family's support, for crying out loud. So I think that has started to change, thankfully.
That's good.
Yeah.
How long ago did you leave?
So I have a little bit of a different experience in Mormonism than many, because it never really resonated with me, even as a little girl. It never, one of my early memories, so this is a long way of answering your question. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. One of my early memories happened inside a Mormon church. And I remember that there were heater vents along the floors of the church. And so I would kind of stand my feet on either side of that heater vent and let it blow my dress out, and
Marilyn
I'm looking
Monroe.
at my dress. Yes. So I look at my dress and I'm just thinking, I wonder if all the adults are just lying to all the kids. Like, wonder if that's, and that kind of just stuck with me. And I didn't, the things that I heard even as a kid were like, really? And it's still that way. And I think maybe that's a little, I've benefited from that. It's been a little protection for me because, well, on one hand, I never really fit in there, and I was never really trusted in I felt like I was never trusted in kind of Mormon circles. I was always just a little bit, here are the Mormons and here's Jolyn a little bit. But on the other hand, I've seen and heard so many stories of so many who like fully believed and spent their lives terrified about which level of heaven they were not going to make it to and all of that. And I just think I was spared all of that. So, so to answer your question, as soon as I left my parents' home, I think I really started separating myself, but it was a slow separation. And there were times when I started having children where I thought, okay, well, I'll go back to church to have a structure for my children. And then I would see things and hear things and just, okay, no, this is not the structure I want for my children. And so it was a slow process, but it was through my mid-20s, early to mid-20s, that I really left. Now, my family, a few of the others in my family, my siblings have left as well over time and in different ways. My parents and part of my siblings are still very actively involved in the church. So I still have that kind of through my family, some attachment, I guess, to the church a little bit, but it's really arm's length. So I hear things second and third hand, but.
And are your parents allowed to communicate with you, or are there reservations about that? Are there restrictions?
Yeah. So, in thinking, it may be easiest to compare how Mormonism handles this to how Scientology, for example, handles. So Scientology has fair game, right? Even like Jehovah's Witnesses, practice shunning, and it's written and it's a policy, and this is what you do, and you have to do this. Mormonism is more, it's more like a whisper campaign, I think is the best way I could describe it. It's, you just know growing up in Mormonism. And I guess I would like to talk to somebody who joins later on, like how they get it, like how you're supposed to act, because it's not written anywhere. But they're just, if they had the truth and they left, it's a little dangerous. You just don't want to, she's inactive, he's inactive, and you know what that means. Right. And so there's that. So they're not told don't talk to a family member who's left, but it's, they've left. And truly Mormonism believes, because when after we die, we go into one of the 3 levels of heaven. If your family member doesn't join you in that level of heaven, you're never going to see them again. And one of the huge draws of Mormonism is we'll be together after we die. And how dare this person leave and ruin all of that for me as a parent, for me as a sibling? Like, you've made this choice, right? So so I still have contact with them, but it's because of that culture, that kind of those whisper campaigns, kind of quiet judgment. I would say it has to be arm's length. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
which is slightly better than the Jehovah's Witnesses, who in turn are slightly better than Scientology.
right.
Is there the sense, I mean, with the Jehovah's Witnesses, there's the sense that the devil is involved in some way in this. Do Mormons believe that people who've left because they've come under the influence of the devil?
I think so. Yeah. And again, it's because of the kind of whisper campaign. You don't hear like this person has, been pulled away by the devil, but it is, there are dark forces in this world. It's believed. And yeah, it's why else would you leave the one true church? Because truly Mormonism is the only way to get to heaven. Right. So why would you leave otherwise?
And it's the only way to get to one of 3 levels of heaven, I just heard. So
Yes.
could you
Yes.
perhaps tell us about those 3 levels of heaven? Because I want the best one. I want the 5-star one,
Me too. Me too. Definitely. I wish I could tell you more about that. They
But it's such
all
a long time.
confuse me so much. And the things, here's what I do know. The things that you have to do in order to get to one of those top 2 levels include going to the Mormon temple, performing the ceremonies in that Mormon temple that are called endowments, and living that life so that you can do that, having your family. I think you can still go to the top tier if everyone in your family doesn't, but I mean, you've got to be nearly perfect to get there. Like you really, and so there are 4 things I think that I've identified that Mormons really have to do in order to get to either of those top 2. I think the bottom one, I might be okay. We might be okay.
We'll meet there.
Yeah, we might be okay to get the bottom one. I'm not sure about that after this conversation, but so but there are the top 2. I think there are 4 things really that need to be done. You need to be baptized Mormon. I was baptized Mormon, so you might need to work on that one.
Yeah, we're gonna do that.
Yeah, the endowments you need to take. You need to get married in the temple. Oh, and the second part of baptism is just the confirmation, so a blessing afterwards. So and for those of us who don't do that when we're alive, we can have our names put onto a list, and the youth of the Mormon Church. I did this as a teenager. They have the teenagers go in and do baptisms for the dead. So if you live your life and you don't learn about Mormonism, you can still make it to one of those upper levels if somebody gets baptized for you. And you can even get to the higher levels if somebody does endowments for you. So the adults will go back to the temple on a regular basis and do, these ceremonies, the endowment ceremonies for the dead as well. So, yeah.
And do Mormons
All is
believe in?
not lost.
I'm sorry.
I said all is not lost.
All is
So,
not.
yeah.
Do Mormons believe in hell?
Do you know what? They may. So this is another thing that if it's not talked about a lot, it's really focused on let's go to one of the higher kingdoms. And so it's not the kind of fire and brimstone stuff that you hear in some other religions. It's really not focused on. So yeah.
Well, this is sounding very attractive to me, I must say.
No, right.
And can you hang out with people in the other heavens, or are you just in yours?
That's the key. That's the key. Yeah, you've got to stay in your own.
Yeah.
That's the separation. That's why you have to really make that effort to get up there.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, you just never caught the belief. It didn't happen, and it's interested me that that's true for so many second generation members that they just, it's like, what? So perhaps about half of Scientologists who've grown up as children through it will leave, and they'll leave, sort of, they get to be 16 or so, and they'll say, I don't want to do this anymore.
Can't do this.
It is interesting that the mindset has to be created, and that once something shakes that, seriously, and that's usually a problem with the leadership or with the teachings. That some of the many contradictions that tend to exist in such groups shine through, and you're able to walk away. Of course, my friend Steve Hassan and many others have long talked about the induction of guilt and of phobia. I've generally also add to that aversion, that there are these three things that are used to manipulate people. To what extent, as a child growing up in the Mormon Church, are you exposed to those things: phobia, guilt, and aversion?
To a huge extent. Oh, absolutely. The phobias, not making it to heaven, not being with your family, there are dangers out there in the world, right? And the othering too, that's part of it. Like we can't be like them. The cost is too high. You can't drink coffee. The cost is too high. You know what I mean? So
it has become expensive, coffee, over the years, so.
Right. Well, way more expensive for Mormons than for the rest of you lot. But
it's like it cost me £2 for a cup, but a Mormon would be damned to the lowest form of heaven as a consequence.
Right, two pounds in heaven. That's what it costs. So yeah. So there is I think that's super crafty in a lot of these high demand religions, Mormonism included. Whether or not they go as far as to be, a cult is up for debate, I suppose. I look at your friend Stephen's, the bite model, and every piece of that I can identify in the Mormon religion. And I think, well, okay, what do we do with that? I think what's more important for me, and especially in my work, is has it been harmful? Is it harmful to you?
Absolutely.
And yeah. So if there are some things that I learned growing up in that church that I love to focus on family and supporting each other. Now the execution in that religion is a little bit different than the things that I find super helpful and attractive. And that is, let's be supportive and let's be together as long as you follow all of these rules, right? And if you don't, then that's all taken away, even to a lesser degree than the shunning that some other groups do. But
I was in St. Petersburg a few years ago, which was great. Not really recommending it at the moment.
Not right now. Yeah, not so much.
Remarkable place, and I met a man. He was 35 years old, and he'd been a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he'd left, and he told me that his parents wouldn't talk to him. And I've been around this kind of thing for 40 years now. Since I left Scientology, I've met thousands of people who've been involved in all sorts of things. But it really hit home. As a parent, I have 4 children. The thought that anybody or anything could persuade me not to unconditionally love and support my children, that's wrong. It's plain and simply wrong. Even if my children are naughty, and they are, and do things that I don't approve of, and they're all adults now as well, so there's no excuse for it. But I have often said that if, as long as they tell me, I will help them bury the bodies. The commitment to our children should be supreme, and so anything that interferes with that worries me tremendously.
Yes.
We came to the word cult, the C word, as some people call it. I, for a long time, advocated its use because it's not a pejorative term. It means a dedication to a person or a doctrine. And so Christianity could be called the Jesus cult without any insult being there. Sometime in the 1970s, a variety of social scientists picked up on the idea that this was a pejorative term, and the media didn't help. So it now doesn't mean what it
As it
means.
rarely does. Yeah.
Mm.
Media never helps with anything, but
Well, it is sensationalism, isn't it? But I exactly what you say. So many people come to me and they'll describe, um, a friend, a family member has become involved in this group. Is it a cult? And I say, is it harmful?
right.
Has something bad happened? Because whether it's a cult or not doesn't matter to me. What does matter is, are the views in the group extreme?
Mhm.
Is the group hateful towards other people, particularly former members? And
Mhm.
most essential, is the group authoritarian? Does it tell you what to do, and you have to do it or else? Are you allowed to ask questions? Are you allowed to doubt? And
Mhm.
when we cross those lines, and especially when we come to the point of shunning or disconnection, as it's called in Scientology, I think we're dealing with what my friend Kristen Shirko would call an extreme authoritarian sect. And this has been thoroughly confused by
Yeah.
historians of religion and social scientists who introduced this term, new religious movements. And
Mm.
the author, I have an interview with the author of the book, New Religious Movements, Professor Eileen Barker, which I put up a few weeks ago. And she now says, I don't use that expression anymore, which I'm pleased to hear, because what's wrong with calling these things belief systems? You know,
Yeah. Yeah. When you have a forced belief system or a coerced belief system, I think that's the issue right there, right?
yeah.
It's,
And whether it's
yeah.
new, whether it's religious, and these scholars will list groups like Earhart Seminar Training, the Forum Landmark Trust, LifeSpring, those kind of groups, and multi-level marketing groups as religions. They're new religious movements, and it seems unscholarly in the extreme to me, and unnecessary. And it's created polarization where there are pro-cult apologists, some of them scholars, some of them not, who they have this polarized view that there's just, it's black and white. There's no such thing as brainwashing. That's a commonplace. And it's like, well, why are you using the word brainwashing? So one of my
That
questions,
happens. Yeah.
one of my questions to Professor Barker was, what did she think about influence? And I wanted to see what she would say. In the UK in 2015, we introduced a law um, about coercive control. And it only as yet applies to intimate relationships, but people have been prosecuted under this law for not for their physical violence towards their partner, but the psychological control they have over them. And I was very interested by Professor Barker's response. She's a professor of sociology. She's emerita now from London School of Economics, and very well known. And she said, talking of influence, that would be a matter for a psychiatrist. And it seemed to me, how can you study, as she has, a group like the Moonies for decades and not say that there is influence involved? It'd be like saying, why do you teach at a university if you don't think that education influences people? What's the point of giving information to people if it doesn't influence them? And is there a spectrum of influence where that influence becomes coercive? And I think there rather obviously is. And so, scholars who are seeking to dodge this question package everything up as brainwashing and believing that members of these extreme authoritarian sects are zombies, that somebody is suggesting that all free will is taken away from them. Joost Meerloo in the 1950s wrote about menticide, the killing of the brain. And I don't think that, I've not seen that happen other than by a blow to the head, possibly. But,
right.
There is always the individual there. There is always the responsibility that the individual should take, I believe. And so I haven't yet met any zombies. I tend to reserve the term brainwashing for the people who first used it, the Chinese, the phrase "xi nao," meaning wash brain, literally, that they have the right to say that that's what's happened in the so-called re-education camps. And similar processes are very much occurring within authoritarian groups at different levels. So, for example, the notion of the hot seat, which we find in many groups now, where the individual is put on a chair and everybody in the group shouts abuse at them and accuses them of things. This comes straight from the Chinese thought reform camps, and is presumably has been practiced in Xinjiang on the million people put into those.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, the whole cults, all of that debate, rather than sort of, I have this feeling that there are some social scientists who, had they walked around Auschwitz, would have commented on the quality of the pajamas. They
Right.
do have nice pajamas,
Right.
at least, without focusing on, there are things that are proper and humane ways of treating people, and that there are things which are dictatorial, tyrannical, and authoritarian. And I fear that our society is still on that end of the scale. Even in the democracies, authoritarianism is a strong force. We see it at its extreme in these groups. So you are a trauma recovery therapist. Is that the right sort of area that you're working in? You help people to recover from trauma?
Yeah, I do, but I'm not a therapist.
Okay.
I'm a coach. Yeah, I chose the coaching route for a few reasons. Some of them specific, I guess, maybe to the US, and others just with the modality of trauma recovery. So I knew, after coming through some traumatic experiences of my own and realizing, really learning what trauma is, first of all, what emotional trauma is, and how you can actually heal from it. Like at one point in the process, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to be the same. Right. And so realizing that there is treatment, that there are ways to heal, and that I can actually help people. I was a coach already, a business coach. So I've already worked kind of in that coaching modality, but with education around trauma, I have really been able to connect with a lot of trauma, people experiencing trauma, and I've been able to help them through it. So I became certified as a trauma recovery coach. The other thing in the US, therapists are limited to by state lines, and there are some licenses that you can get that cover multiple states and things like that, but there are always limitations, and I didn't want those specific limitations. The other thing with therapy versus coaching is, therapy is beautiful in many ways, especially with mental illnesses. There's a need in therapy for a little bit of a separation. I'm the therapist. I'm, a doctor, or almost like a doctor, right? And I'm going to help you through this experience. But with coaching, I'm able to connect on a more personal level. I'm able to share my own experiences, which is super important with trauma recovery. You're not alone in this. Here's what my experience was. Here's what worked for me. Here's what's worked for other people. Let's try some of these things with you. One thing that trauma does specifically is really isolates people, right? In their own minds. It's like there's shame involved with it a lot of times, and there's a natural reaction during a traumatic experience to just isolate and be on your own. A lot of people are experiencing that after COVID. A lot of people, they're not realizing that this could be a trauma response for them, but it's like, nope, I just don't want to be with anyone else. So having somebody who you can connect with and trust and share experiences and be kind of on the same level with is super healing. So, and that's harder to do as a therapist than as a coach. So
it's a very important distinction, and I'm glad to have it explained. I know in the US, as you say, you have the crossing a state line and not having a license, which is weird.
Right, I think so too.
But it works in Massachusetts, but you can't do it in Vermont. Okay. But also there's this, you have to have a master's degree to call yourself a counselor and this kind of thing. And I must say, and I'm going to say, because I'm well known for this kind of thing, I suppose by now, and I'm old enough to be doing this, that I've actually seen far more former members of authoritarian groups messed up by therapists than helped by therapists. And I think what you are talking about actually goes to the heart of the matter, that having an external authority who is going to apply a system to you when you have just come out of a group where an external authority applies a system to you, and not having that, it's a, you can be more in a peer-to-peer relationship. And I've always found that, I've come away from the whole concept of counseling, and I, dip my head into all sorts of of course, 9 years in Scientology. Scientology was praised by Fritz Perls and by Carl Rogers. To my amazement, I don't think they'd really looked very deeply into it. I think Fritz Perls may have grabbed a couple of ideas from Hubbard personally, with his Gestalt therapy. And that authority relationship is fundamental to cultic relationship. So coming along and saying, it's like with bereavement counselors or relationship counselors, and we use the word counselor in this country without fear of being sued or put in prison. But very often the really effective people are people who've had the experience and can share their experience. And the first really important thing is to say, and I got past it, and
I got past it, right.
It's still going to be there. If you've lost somebody you love, there will still be that sense of loss for the rest of your life. But it can be something that's manageable, and it can be something that's integrated. In my own case, when my mother died, and I looked after her for the last years of her life, she was 94 when she died. That when I think about her, there is a slight wistful sense, but she'd made it very clear that she'd had enough, and she'd said that she didn't want to go to heaven and she didn't want to reincarnate. She was done. And
if I can put in my wishes, please let it be that. Yeah.
And so it pleases me to think of her. I can look back. It doesn't, I'm not desolate. I'm not. Yeah. So it's integrating the experience, digesting the experience, and finding that you can do that. How long ago did you start working with this?
Yeah, if I can go back just
briefly to
the therapy versus coaching conversation too. I want to add a couple of things there, and that is the first big trauma in my life that brought me to my knees. I did seek therapy for that. I actually, and I mentioned that therapist in my book because she saved my life. And it was therapy. There was that division. She didn't have the experience that I had, although she's had some life experience around what I went through at the time. But I think there are therapists out there who can navigate the laws and the way you do things. There is a therapist in the US, Rachel Bernstein, who is amazing.
Rachel's fantastic. I know Rachel.
Yes. And one of the things that she does, though, is she throws out that I'm going to maintain separate. And she talks about, she actually purposefully connects with her clients as well, which is, not typically what therapists are taught to do. But in this case, that she does that on purpose. She talks about doing that on purpose. And so I think that the right therapist, just like the right coach, can really, really help and should be sought, but with care, both modalities, with some care and thought, like what do I want to look for here? I think the person is more important than the degree. And
you've got to feel right with that person. I agree absolutely with what you're saying. With Rachel, one of the advantages is that Rachel very thoroughly understands cultic involvement.
Yes.
And if you don't, and you try and use the cookie cutter approach, then disaster can ensue. And
exactly.
I have a friend who's a clinical psychologist, and she did a master's degree, and she, 30 years ago or whatever, 25 years ago, and she says that she wishes she'd done her degree and master's degree in social psychology, because what she found out about counseling by doing it, and that all of the various and many schools and systems that were given to her, it is, as you say, about making a connection with a person and allowing them to develop, helping them to, you're a catalyst for something. You are not going to go in there and tinker with the works and get them to do
Right.
it. And sometimes, looking at, say, Rollo May's existential therapy, where, fascinating and brilliant man, but the idea is your worldview is wrong, my worldview is right. I'm going to teach you my worldview. It's existential, and I'm not really very interested in that. When somebody comes, I'm not really directly involved with many people anymore. I'm theoretically retired. But when somebody came to me, the thought would be, and it so often happened that after a couple of meetings, they'd be asking me what I believed. They'd want to know, if they could follow me in some way, a transference or what have you. And to be able to say, I'm here to help you work your way through it and come to a point where you're in charge of you. I don't want to be in charge of you. Thank you. I have children.
Yes. Yeah. I'm involved with several groups of people who are coming out of various kind of high demand religions, and I'll see posts on social media. What do we believe about this? And it's just so common, right? This is where we're coming from. We need to believe something. What do we believe? And so that is a very, very difficult transition to, I actually can believe this for myself. I can develop my own ideologies. Like I can pick, from different mindsets and evolve it to my own, and it's okay. So it's a big deal.
It's the commonplace that I think Margaret Singer in Cults in Our Midst talks about. Somebody's come out of a group, and you go to a restaurant, and they get the menu, and they say, "What would I like?"
Yes.
Getting somebody through to the point where their own choice and their own individuality is essential. Their own voice, their own expression is essential. And and we have critical thinking and all of that good stuff. But okay, so how long ago did you come to this work?
That's right. You asked that a long time ago. So
I did, but you needed to comment on something that had already been said. So that's good.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. So it has been, I want to say my first trauma really happened back in the 20 teens, and not super long ago. But that's where my education started. And I've probably spent maybe the last several years coaching those who, and I started in the prison world because my experience had been as a family member of somebody who was incarcerated.
Okay.
So a lot of those people come to me just naturally because I speak a lot in that world, and I spend a lot of time in that world with those with people who are treated like criminals because they are related to someone who committed a crime. But as time has gone on, more people leaving, specifically Mormonism, but other religions, high demand religions as well, have started saying, Jolyn, what you say resonates with me too. And so I have focused more in the last couple of years on in that area, in this area as well. And it's, some of the similarities are surprising, that prison families go through, and families, people leaving high demand religions or having family members in these coercive control groups too. So it's a little bit strange there that the worldview questions, the existential questions that happen as you are unwinding yourself from a high demand group or a coercive group is similar to what happens when you realize, oh my gosh, normal people get arrested and they're not like less than. So anyway, some similarities there. So it's been a few years, only a few years. that I have been working in this field.
Mm. The expression "treated like criminals" I latch onto because I don't think anybody should be treated like a criminal.
Yeah.
I think that part of the problem in our society is that negative behavior, and it shocks and amazes me that the prison system has become so damaging, so that it has often become simply a hothouse to train people in criminality and to make them more resentful and less concerned. And there is good work to suggest that treating people in a compassionate way is helpful, which is not to, if somebody's done something seriously damaging, then I do believe they should be restrained, but I don't believe they should be punished. I don't see any virtue in causing pain to people. I don't think it will make them improve. And where we can, we should rehabilitate people. So, that's just a side note on, how we treat people. I think we should treat people in a kind and compassionate fashion, but look to the good of society. So if we need to separate somebody from society, we should do that.
Yes. Yeah. I agree with that as well. And I do think, I remember thinking when I was in the thick of it, I thought, if we wanted to come up with a system that would create a violent person out of a kind, mild person, we could not have come up with a better system.
Mm-hmm.
We just couldn't have come up with. So it's evolved into that. Here's where we are. There are a million things that need to be done, especially in the US, but around the world as well. But the US is particularly egregious in this area. It's
Yeah. So, I mean, there are more people per head of population incarcerated in the US than in any other country in the world. I mean, the conditions are not as bad as Russian prisons or Chinese prisons, but in comparison with, say, Western Europe, they are among the worst prisons there are. That in fact, in Scandinavia, where you have a fairly strict system, the prisons do look at people as human beings with rights. And I think there's a case, and I've talked about this before, there was a reform school for children and adolescents called Pepper Harrow, and a documentary was made about it. That's Pepper with one P, Pepper Harrow. Documentary was made, I think, in 1973, and they then did a follow-up with kids who'd been there, and they'd focused on 6 kids. One had died in the interim. One didn't want to be interviewed, but the other 4 were all interviewed. And my jaw dropped. I saw this documentary many years ago, because you've got an 8-year-old child walking around smoking a cigarette, and you've got all of these long-haired people looking after them. It's like, oh dear, hippy dippy or what? But their reoffence rate was 10% over 2 years. The reoffence rate by the time the documentary was made, somewhere around 1990, was 80%, because of a policy called the short, sharp shock, brought in under Margaret Thatcher by a man called William Whitelaw, which of course is a quotation from Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado, short, sharp shock being actually execution with an axe. But
oh my gosh,
their idea was, so he thought it was funny quoting this phrase. But their idea was that you would brutalize kids, like the boot camps that people send their kids to in the US. And that in some way would have a positive effect on society. And it does seem that there are these 2 extremes. There are people who believe that we're fundamentally evil. There are people who believe that we're fundamentally good. Martin Buber, when interviewed by Carl Rogers said, I think you would agree with me, Martin, that man is basically good. And Martin Buber, I think rather sensibly, said, yes, man is basically good and evil. I take that mid position. So the idea that people are evil, so you have to brutalize them, or the idea that they're good, so you don't need to do anything, they'll work it out themselves. These are false assumptions, but they're profound. And I think many people are taken up with revenge and wanting to get their own back. And as a society, we have to realize that is of itself a disorder. of course, if somebody hurt one of my children, I'd probably kill them. But I don't believe in
Right.
capital punishment. So,
Yeah.
so I
Yeah. I hear
understand.
I hear you. I think what comes up for me when you tell that story, people are mostly good and evil, and what comes up for me is, with that knowledge, with that insight, where do we want to shine the light on people? What do we want to encourage, and what do we want to bring out and expose more?
Yeah.
And that to me makes the most sense. What do you want to see? Because that's where you need to focus your attention. And our prison systems don't do that. Our prison system. But to tie in a little bit, I was having a conversation with a gentleman recently who has a lot of experience with Jehovah's Witnesses and the shunning, and the comparison was made between a child being taken away from a parent and incarcerated, and the Jehovah's Witnesses practice of parents having to shun their children, and adult children or minors, either one, and how absolutely horrific and painful that is, and how complete a comparison that is. I just think, in one case, the state or the government is taking someone physically away and putting them physically behind bars or walls or whatever it may be, and causing a physical separation. With shunning, it's an emotional, psychological separation, even if they're near you, equally as damaging on both parts, equally as damaging, in the whole, and just an awful practice, when it's avoidable. Like you say, if somebody's actually causing danger in a community, we do need to protect our community. But yeah, this separation and isolation is so unnatural and damaging. It's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful.
And I mean, there is good work that shows that ostracism is traumatizing. And if we look into the work you're doing, that by traumatizing people in prison, you are not going to improve them. They're not going to get better. They're going to get more devious, more cunning, more skillful, more manipulative, and taking all sorts.
Oh, I'm sorry, I talked over you. I'm 90 to 95% of people who are in prisons being treated like that, being psychologically damaged, traumatized, are coming back to our communities. So we thinking about that, it's like, for those who don't care about those people, at least care about your own community and your own self. Can we look at that, because they are coming back.
And it's created enormous problems. Most of the gang culture in the US, and my interest, as you were saying before, that it's interesting to see that the same dynamics apply in all human groups. And so I, in the 1990s, became very interested in terrorism as a subject, and looked at what is now being called radicalization and how that was performed, and found that, I mean, Al Qaeda actually published a manual, which I have in my book, Opening Our Minds, which is very similar to the Moonies recruiting manual. And you're dealing with the same psychological aspects. And so if you treat people well, you might have a good outcome. If you treat people badly, you will have a bad outcome. And as you say, those people will come out into society cynical and self-interested. In fact, one could say that the prisons are largely a training ground for psychopaths, a way of making people less compassionate, less empathetic towards others, and more self-involved, because they have to look out for themselves in that environment. They have to all the time be watching out for themselves, and this is not good. Let's get to the what should have been the topic of this conversation, which is, you have a new book out. Yes,
I do. It's actually the day that we're recording. Today is launch day for my book. Actually, yeah. So by the time people see this, it will be available, Amazon and Barnes and Noble initially, other places as well. But those are the two initial places it's available online. The book's title is Trauma Recovery, a 90-day guidebook to building a great life after trauma. And it's a planner / narrative about trauma and how to recover, loaded with exercises that are available and helpful for people who are going through traumatic experiences to help bring them out of those experiences. So 90 days, that is not anywhere near a guarantee that in 90 days you're going to feel better or be completely healed from trauma, but it's going to put you on a path to healing that is similar to the path that I took and that many others have taken with with the exercises that help at different stages of trauma recovery. So yeah, excited. I'm hoping that is helpful for a lot of people.
Yes, I imagine it will be. Okay, well, this has been great, and let's get together sometime in the future, and you can tell me how immensely successful the book has been.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that.
And we can probe a little deeper. So thank you very much. This has been great.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate the conversation. Pleasure.
Yeah, and I think I mispronounced your name at the start. It's Jolyn.
It's Jolyn. I thought that I don't think that you did. Maybe you did.
I got close to Jolene because of the country song.
That's people do that. It's I didn't even notice for that reason because it's So.
I had an American friend called Vaughn Young, and he called me John, and I called him Vaughn. And it took a couple of years. I realized you had to invert these, that his name was Vaughn and my name is John.
Yes. Yes. So John, more of a fuller O.
Yes. Well, it's my birth name is Jonathan. So
okay.
It's just
gotcha.
I couldn't afford the H, so I'm just J-O-N.
Right. It's a good name. Very good.
Yeah, I like it. It's done me well, but it's quite surprising to find that there are actually at least 2 other people in the world who are called John Atack, spells both names the same. And
wow.
I would like to apologize to them because they have no doubt been at some point harassed by Scientology.
Exactly.
One of them's a sound engineer from Oregon who I think was working in Paris, and the other is a chemist. And academia.edu keeps sending me these things saying how many thousands of mentions my papers have had. And I think it's this other guy.
Oh, that's hilarious. Oh, that's so funny. Well, I sat next to a woman and had a pleasant several-hour conversation on a plane once. And she asked me when the plane was landing, hey, I'd like to stay in touch with you. Can we exchange numbers? And her name was Jolyn Armstrong. And I'm like, no. So we're fast friends. So yeah.
I did have a guy knock on my door once many years ago. I was living in Stafford in England, and there was this old guy in his 80s, and he said, my name's John Atack. He was John, having said that. And but he was tired of getting phone calls which were actually meant for me.
People looking for help with their cult experience.
Well, no, you see, at this time I was still involved in Scientology, so who knows? But such it is. Anyway, it's been a great pleasure, and we will meet again.
Okay, thanks, John. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.